Good morning from California. This is Jeremy Martin, Vice President for Energy and Sustainability at the Institute of the Americas. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to today's webinar, Geothermal Energy Systems of the Future. And this is our third and final installment in our series, launched almost a year ago, June of last year. We launched this series in collaboration with the Geothermal Energy Advancement Association. So we're really pleased for those of you who've been able to join us for the previous two editions, and those who are back again with us for the third. If you missed the first two, no problem. But thanks for joining us for the third. Some quick logistics, the usual stuff. Q&A is already open. Q&A is available. So please avail yourself. Don't wait. There's no time. You don't have to wait to a time at the end to post questions. If you hear something or if there's a burning issue that you want to put to the panelists, you can do that any point of the webinar this morning. So you can use the Q&A function, as I'm sure everyone is very well aware of Zoom by now. I'm going to put the full agenda in the chat here in a minute, just so everyone has that as a reference. But we'll have a brief welcome remarks from yours truly, and then we'll have some speaker introductions by Chris Sladen and some brief speaker remarks, and then we'll get into the main content of the session. In a way of trying to engender a little bit of participation and see also where everyone's joining us, if you can jump in the chat and post where you're joining us from today. It's always, we've done this a couple times now. It's always a fun way for people to join. And I'll go first here. So I'm just going to I'll call what state I'm joining from. So let us know where you're joining us from. We think we have people, well, at least the panel's from all over. So we're curious to see where our participants are from. All right, pretty strong U.S. contingency so far. All right, Canada, there we go. Excellent. No, we appreciate people jumping in and letting us know where they're from, or where they're joining us from, for that matter, today as part of this webinar. And feel free to keep using the chat as well. If you want to engage with one another. We really want this to be, in as much as it's a webinar and we have a group of expert panelists who are going to be speaking to you, want to have you all also perhaps engage a little bit. So we launched this series, like I mentioned, almost a year ago, and the goal was to really look at the potential for geothermal and the outlook for geothermal, particularly energy across the Americas. Now, we'll come back to that and get a little bit beyond energy today in our final series. But in the first two series, we really focused on Latin America. We focused on this hemisphere, the Americas. I'll let Chris talk a little bit about those first couple of editions in his remarks. But we had some unique conversations, including from just here over across the county border in the Imperial Valley of California, but also Chile and developments in Colombia, and as well from some friends in Mexico. So we are now turning to a much more existential discussion of geothermal, or where it will be, kind of to wrap up the series today. And we'll dive into where it fits in our world of decarbonization, and maybe someone want to call it electrification. And also, well, like I said, move a little bit beyond just the energy side of it and move to some of the heat and cooling elements or uses or opportunities. And we'll use this crystal ball. I hinted we're going to look into the crystal ball. We're going to use the 2050. It seems to be a lot of reference points are around the 2050 timeline. We're going to ask our panelists to look into their crystal balls and say exactly what their thoughts are about geothermal come the year 2050. And we'll have a poll. So again, this audience participation is something we want to have. And so we'll have a poll where you all can, let's say, check the experts and their analysis of where we'll be in 2050, and just exactly what the outlook and the scalability of geothermal for energy, heating, cooling, all kinds of uses, electrification, and as we move into this net zero world and our net zero pathway. So in the custom of our energy webinar series, I'm going to shorten my remarks to what I've already said, keep it there, hand the microphone over to Chris Sladen. And Chris is our partner from the Geothermal Energy Advancement Association, but he's also a good friend. He wears the hat of non-resident fellow at the Institute of the Americas. He came into geothermal from the oil and gas sector. Chris is a lifelong, or was a lifelong, BP executive working in the oil patch all over the world, and so really brings some unique perspectives to geothermal from that oil and gas segment of the energy sector. And he was a long-standing board member of the Institute. And so, Chris, it's always a pleasure, and I really appreciate your thought leadership, not just at the Institute, but in launching and executing this webinar series. So thanks for your partnership. Thanks for GEAA's partnership. And over to you for some remarks, and then we'll get into the panel.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Jeremy, and welcome everyone. And thank you for the Institute collaborating with the Geothermal Energy Advancement Association to create this series, Geothermal Across the Americas. In parts 1 and part 2, we looked at how geothermal can be a game changer, whether it's heat, whether it's power or minerals, and its ability to supply sustainable, low carbon energy across Latin America. We talked about decarbonizing the energy sector, and we had some deep dives into particular locations. We had deep dives on Chile, on Mexico, Colombia, California and the Salton Sea. We've discussed other issues like corrosion and scale, the challenges of producing formation water, the ability to repurpose oil and gas wells, use of open loop, closed loop. Well, today, in part 3, we're very much focusing on, I describe it as 2 questions of, can geothermal be a big player in the energy transition and the 2050 net zero challenge? And if it can it also reset? So can geothermal reset energy politics and energy security throughout the Americas? Well, for this conversation, I'm delighted to introduce Anne, who's with Geothermex SLB, and Floris, who's with Sprawl. Let's begin with just 2 minutes each, Anne and Floris, saying something about yourselves and some opening remarks and how you became involved in geothermal. Anne, please start, and then Floris, and then back to yourself, Jeremy.
All right, thanks, Chris. No worries. Well, it's interesting you asked that because when I was doing my bachelor's degree in geology, which was quite a long time ago now, all of my compatriots were leaving after they graduated with their bachelor's degree to Houston and New Orleans to do 2 things mainly: sedimentary petrology and well log analysis, which I knew something about and thought, oh, I don't really fancy that. But I liked the energy idea. And so I began to look for other types of energy, and geothermal was so, geologically related, it really struck a chord with me. And so I decided that I needed to look into that, wrote a senior thesis, thought, well, I don't know enough about this, ended up going to New Zealand to do a master's degree at the University of Auckland, which had and still has a geothermal institute, focusing on geothermal. So I sort of cut my teeth there, and then when it was time to finish, I knew that there was another person who had been at the University of Auckland. There was a series of Fulbright scholars, and I was lucky to be one of them. And so one guy, he was there, and I knew him because we had crossed paths very briefly where he was leaving and I was arriving. And I said, well, what do you think? I know you're working at Geothermex. What's it like? And he said to me, well, it's really interesting work, but if you need a fancy office, don't come here. And I said, I don't need a fancy office. I need to learn geothermal. So that's how I got into it. And just working on hundreds, if not even 1,000 projects around the world, all for geothermal power. We do a little bit of work in geothermal heating, but it's, our work is mostly about power. So I'm a geologist, and I continue to, try to understand where we can get the best flow rates and temperatures. And that's been my life's quest, basically. I'll turn it over to Floris.
Okay, thank you, Anne. It's one of the best things I already see here is that that the people involved in geothermal are all so stoked about the topic and are making it a live effort almost. At least you're showing me. So that's really nice to see. I also started at uni where all my friends wanted to go into petroleum engineering and the petroleum industry, and I did see a kind of initiation of the geothermal industry, and I thought that would suit me, and there were some projects going on, and there was made many mistakes, all in the geothermal heat production, so 60, 70, 80 degrees Celsius, cooling it down to 40, using it in the greenhouses. The projects were initiated by the greenhouse owners often, where they just spoke with a well engineer or a geologist, and there were some ideas and they developed it, but at that beginning in the Netherlands, there are a lot of mistakes being made, so that's always in an emerging industry, but that really developed over time. So between 2009 and recently, I jumped into that, first as a production engineer, later as a project manager, did some drilling operations to 4 kilometers, well testing, expansion of the projects, pushing the limits of the megawatts, the flow rates, and the temperature reductions, and I think it was a great period over the last 13 years in that area, because it really became an industry. It has professionalized, and I'm proud to have taken a part of that. And yeah, with that development, I started a company which we recently merged with Sproul, where Sproul has the oil and gas experience and region of the global reach and know-how. And yeah, that's what we are currently building, and we see that there are so many opportunities around the world, but especially in North America, Canada, South America, and for further expansion in Europe. Mainly what I'm looking at is the heat, but also on the electricity there are quite some overlapping developments. So I'm super keen on developing that, and I'm very pleased for the invitation to have the chat today with you all. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for those opening comments, and like you said, the lifelong commitments and the really personal touches. That's great. It brings a nice personal element that sometimes we don't get. So thank you both for that. Let me make one other comment that I neglected to make earlier, which is that Sproul and Schlumberger, SLB, who Geothermics is part of that group of companies, are both members of the Institute of the Americas Energy and Sustainability Steering Committee. And I think this also is a great way to underscore just exactly where we are in this debate around net zero and energy security and energy transition, where two companies that honestly have done a lot of work with us in the last several years around principally oil and gas issues and geopolitics. And we have both speakers from those companies today on the geothermal webinar. So it's a nice little point to sort of emphasize our opening here. So Floris, let's stay with you. I want to get into now the first question to pose to the panel. And it dials right in. It gets back to some of the things that you both alluded to already, but let's get into this in regards to, you know, we like to talk a lot about the opportunity for geothermal in terms of the low carbon base load, the heat and power opportunities. So the question directly to you, and you hinted at your focus more on the heat side of it. So why don't you share your views and insights, very, a little bit more details around geothermal as part of the decarbonization pathway and net zero goals. And Anne, we'll have you focus more on the power side, but let's start with you, Floris, on heat, and then go to Anne after that.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Well, if you look at Europe over the last decades, it was a small market in the past, but it really developed rapidly. So where you look at Paris, the Paris basin, there is already heat production from that basin a long time in the carbonates. If you look at the Munich area, it really developed over the last 10 years in a very exponential way. Same happened in the Netherlands for the greenhouses. And what I think, which is interesting, is to see that in some countries it's really developing because of the demand side. There is demand. There are people who want to have that heat. They know you can harvest it, and they push that development. Government often follows and tries to stimulate along the road. to bridge that gap with the competitor, which is normally fossil fuel burning for heating purposes. And I think that in some of those countries, the support regimes have really helped to establish that, and it does really become part of the mix, especially for dedicated industries. So an industry which can really use that heat. It can be greenhouses, can be breweries, can be anything which uses heat in the right temperature range. But also, of course, the built environment. And that's where you see the next development coming in. And if that really continues to grow, and if all the different stakeholders manage to connect the geology with each building in certain areas around it, that will make a dramatic increase, an exponential increase again. That means a lot of investment, heat networks, connections to the houses, connection to the different wells. Well, the drilling rig you see behind me is only located 2 kilometers away from a municipality where a lot of people live. So it is possible to drill close to a city or even within, with the right safety measures taken in place. So I think both on the industry side and the built environment there is definitely a big chance to grow significant.
If I can just jump in on the heating side, even though I'm supposed to be the power person,
Go for it.
I'll just say that, you know, ground source heat pumps, which are a shallow geothermal exchange phenomenon, basically, this is also something that can really contribute. It doesn't actually produce geothermal fluids as you might do in greenhouses and heating networks, like in the Paris Basin, for example. There's many heating networks and quite a bit from that supply geothermal fluids. So this is nice. But we do a lot of work. We don't do a lot of work in heat pumps, but there is a lot of action and growth in the geothermal or ground source heat pump sector. And this is a great way to decarbonize buildings. You know, heating and cooling both can be achieved through this process. So, and I'll just note that in the United States, there's a company in Boston that is deciding that because of these leaky gas pipes, old gas pipes in the city of Boston, they're going to build a district geothermal network using heat pump technologies, but it's going to be a distributed network, not just an individual building or an individual home, you know. You know, this drilling on a small footprint, you know, in the urban environment, and I think that's a really good point that you made, Flores. There's a new sort of technology being used for campus scale heat pump applications that uses a really interesting small rig that sits on a very small spot, and it's definitely designed for the urban environment. So it's that's our one of our sister companies, Celsius Energy, that started up in France, where new gas connections are banned. So something else has to be done. And so this is another solution that geothermal provides. Shall I launch into the power side, Jeremy?
Yeah, although before you do, let's put Flores on feet to the fire and tell us exactly. He pointed to the rig behind him. So where, if you're allowed to say, where is that? Because that's super interesting. I think it's a great example of what you both were just talking about.
Well, this rig you see here was it's quite an old photo actually. It's 2017, and we tried to go into a new reservoir at 4 kilometers depth, but the permeability was way too low. So we did find the aquifer, we did log it, we took the course, but we decided after all that testing to go to only 2 kilometers where there was a proven reservoir. But this is the kind of developments the industry needs. You have to explore, you have to find the new places. And fortunately, in this particular case, it was fully supported by the local municipality, the country subsidy scheme, and it was fully paid by the public. And the reason behind it was that there was so much demand around this location that the shallow aquifer would not be sufficient to heat all the greenhouses. So it was a relatively minor amount of risk money, you could say, which could have enabled a lot of developments. And there are more explorations going on at the moment in Europe to really find those new aquifers. And I think that's brilliant. You need some push from governments to get that first project going on, and then the rest can learn from it and develop it further in a regional setting.
Great. Don't just go there yet. That scalability is, we're going to come back to that, but okay. Thank
Don't
you.
give it away.
That's a great, exactly. You can't let people leave. No, thank you for adding some further comments there. It's wonderful. Great example for discussion. Okay. And back to you. Let's get more into power now. That's your expertise, but let's talk
Sure.
power. Yeah, please.
Thanks. But Floris hit exactly on the key issue that we have in geothermal to produce commercially attractive quantities of hot water, steam, etc., and that is permeability. And it is the single biggest issue that we face, having not enough of it. And I'll just say that in the Paris Basin, they went to a deeper aquifer because the upper one was getting depleted. Fortunately, they're finding pretty good permeability, not as good as the shallower one, but they're doing that there. Of course, public outreach and public acceptance and knowledge about these systems is critically important. Okay, over to the power side. Well, we have today about 16 gigawatts of geothermal power installed around the world. That is the tiniest fraction of what we consume, not way less than 1%, let's just say. And I'll just give you a quick rundown on the top countries. In terms of installed capacity, the US still has the most. We fully expect that Indonesia is going to jump over us quickly, maybe even the Philippines, but say about 3.8 gigawatts in the United States, about 2.4 in Indonesia, about close to 2 gigawatts in the Philippines. We've got Turkey, a country that really benefited from great policy and incentives, about 1.6 gigawatts. New Zealand is just over a gigawatt, a small country, but they're doing a lot with their geothermal, and one dear to my heart. And then we've got Mexico, Kenya, and Italy just inching up on the 1 gigawatt number. So just that gives you sort of an idea of where the most production is. But these are all in the traditional geothermal domains, hot volcanic areas, tectonically active areas, and so forth. And what's happening now, and I think to push us towards decarbonization more, is getting geothermal to scale by the involvement of the oil and gas industry. And just before we started this call, we were chatting. I had been at the Offshore Technology Conference in Houston these past few days. I just got back last night. And there was an entire geothermal technical session. There was an executive dialogue on geothermal that I participated in, with a room that was overflowing with people and people asking great questions. There was another panel we did sort of in the exhibition hall. There's a stage there. Lots of interest from the oil and gas sector and really good questions being asked. And a number of oil and gas companies are, I would maybe not pivoting to geothermal, but certainly doing geothermal. And, the majors were in at the beginning, the oil and gas companies, and they all sort of left one by one thinking, oh, I have something more profitable to produce, oil and gas. And, but they're gradually coming back. And another thing we're seeing, particularly in Latin America, are the state developers, the national oil companies getting involved in geothermal. And I think that's a really important thing. Imagine, the public, shareholders of Chevron or ExxonMobil, they're expecting a certain return on their investments. But national oil companies have a different perspective. They're doing something for their country. They have policy to develop and decisions to be made. So it's kind of smaller operators and national oil companies seem to be particularly interested in this. But Chevron's back in after selling their assets in 2010. They had assets, very good assets, by the way, in Indonesia and some other assets in the Philippines too. And we were really disappointed when I was like, oh no, the last one is gone. But they're back and very active in the geothermal space again. So this gives me a lot of hope, because what we need to do, well, let me just back up. Geothermal power development has been a bit boutique in nature, with a few exceptions. There's some large operators that have really gotten some momentum. I'll point to Calpine at the geysers. You know, they're generating close to 1 gigawatt there. Still, it was at 2 gigawatts at its heyday. And a few others, Ormat, you know, a very large player in the sector, promoting not only their own binary technology, but, you know, developing more geothermal power all around the world as an integrated, actually the only integrated geothermal developer, with everything from upstream to downstream and more. So this type, what we're seeing now is that everybody's thinking about geothermal. And in your previous sessions, you talked about the ability to repurpose wells. Sounds good, not quite as easy as it looks, maybe. But what we do have in the deep sedimentary domain is a wealth of data. And, you know, any basin that's been drilled, you've got so much information. Just forget the whole upstream exploration stage. You've got all the data you need there. But speaking of Latin America, I mean, this is the biggest frontier of untapped geothermal capacity, particularly South America, but there's much more in Central America as well. So you talked about Colombia. I mean, all the countries have significant potential. We're just working now on a project in Chile, a country with wonderful resources that, you know, can't seem to be utilized because of the distance from load centers and the elevation and the access, the whole, you know, infrastructure kind of problem that they have there. And also, I would say the market in Chile is kind of a free market. And so they, you know, they have cheaper alternatives, but let's, and lots of solar, and which is wonderful, you know. So there's Peru waiting, Mexico, mucho más. I mean, there's so much more in that part of the world. And so I think this is going to be the frontier where we see the most growth in geothermal. But, you know, decarbonization, it's a great contributor to it. And I think we'll talk about a little bit later, not only for power and heat, but sort of interesting other applications that can use geothermal as a motivator. So I'll leave it there, and maybe we'll move on to the next question.
No, absolutely. I want
ask whatever you like.
Yeah, no, you hit on something that I want to, before we move on, because there is I do want to pivot a little bit to a very different topic, well, related but different. But the question about, you brought up about national oil companies, and you were at OTC. Can you speak to, because we you know, I think we all know about Pemex and Petrobras and Ecopetrol and YPF, and even ENAP in Chile, and were there any that you interacted with this past week in OTC? Or there any, who would you point to in terms of the NOCs in Latin America where you think they're going to be involved?
I didn't meet too many at OTC, and you've already named the ones that seem to be the most active. But if we can switch away from the Americas, the Middle East has a huge interest in geothermal now. And I've been thinking about Saudi for, I don't know, 15 years, you know, why they don't do geothermal. Yeah. They're actually going to start an exploratory drilling campaign of 10 wells down the west coast of Saudi on land. And my goal there is for offshore geothermal, but, you know, I'm a dreamer, so why not? But we're doing a big project right now in Oman. We're looking at the potential of Oman. And they do have a couple of actually national oil companies that are operating, but there's also majors involved. So a complete assessment of Oman. And we're just about to start a project in Pakistan with UEP, one of the 3 national oil companies there. So in the Middle East, things are heating up, to use a bad pun. And there seems to be a lot of interest. So, and then the other thing I will say is EGS, which is, you know, a technology that uses existing permeability in a rock to make more permeability so that you can get those big flow rates of hot water that you need. This is happening, just starting to happen commercially in the United States. And of course, the U.S. Department of Energy has been funding a lot of work in that. So, and the adjacency to shale is remarkable, and the technology for shale that was already developed by oil and gas is very much being leveraged.
Well, you hit on exactly where I would like to go next with this conversation when you said the U.S. Department of Energy and funding, and Flores actually teed this up as well earlier when you talked about some of that municipal support and that the EU. So let's actually pivot now to what's driving policy, fiscal incentives, tax breaks, and these kinds of things. And I want to look at this since we have the great capability here with Flores in Europe and you here in the U.S. And let's start with Flores and talk about the EU Green Deal, and then we'll come back to you, Anne, and talk about the famous IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. What I want to hear and listen to you all talk about is where these major climate decarbonization, legislative and fiscal efforts are taking or pushing geothermal. So Flores, over to you first on the EU Green Deal and maybe Europe a little more broadly on this whole question of incentivization, tax, fiscal policy, regulation, and just what that means for the sector.
Yeah, thanks. Well, if you look at how the developments I just described in some of the hubs took place, was more related to incentives by country. So each country has its own strategy, its own incentives, whether it's a price per megawatt you produce or a de-risking fee for taking the risk of the first project. There are all kinds of support regimes in different areas. If you look at the Green Deal, it's really made to create larger project developments in various places in Europe, especially I think where is not so much going on yet. Maybe in some Eastern European countries where there's no local regime of stimulation regime for geothermal. In those places, it will probably be the only incentive for that development. So that's, I think, a great development, and I think there will definitely be it will definitely support some of the larger developments in that area. What I found quite interesting, what I saw over the last year, is that the incentive for some of the heat support in the Netherlands was that the subsidy became zero because the gas price increased. The gas price increased so much because of the war in Ukraine, because of closing down the Groningen gas fields. The price simply became so expensive that the competitiveness of geothermal was there. It was already commercial for that particular year. It doesn't mean that everyone was happy with it, because everyone has to pay more for their heat, but it did show a competitiveness which we have never seen before. So I think, and of course we hope that the gas price will go down, but I think that these kind of events will be more often in the future, and already show that it works, that also the incentive programs work, that they have the leverage to the oil and gas market, that they link them. And I think that the way we're going, it might not even be necessary again in 2050 to have any of these incentives in place. So I think we are making the right steps in Europe, but I also see that for the next 10 years, we definitely need something to have that forecast of revenue, because you don't drill geothermal wells for payback time in a couple of years. It will always be more than that. So I think we're on track. Europe is on track. And we should not release it, the good regime which is currently in place.
It's a fascinating point about, I mean, just exactly the spike in energy prices, but it was so acute in Europe with the basically the Russian invasion changing the whole dynamic. There's a question about workforce development. Let's have Anne jump in and share the famous IRA. I don't like calling it. Well, it's the
I know
IRA.
It's an unfortunate name, and really, I mean, it was designed to reduce inflation, which was a thing, and still is to some degree. But it's really an energy bill, you know. And
climate
of course,
and energy.
IRA acronym isn't that great, but. I just want to say that in the United States, there have been other incentives for geothermal in the past. One of the best and most effective ones, it was cost shared drilling, which was in the late 70s, early 80s. And, you know, this was where the Department of Energy and the operators shared the costs 50-50 of drilling exploratory wells to see what we could find. And several fields were discovered that way. So even some blind fields, meaning ones with no obvious thermal manifestations. And so there's been support for geothermal in the early days, certainly. But as we moved forward, you know, the technology was perceived as mature, and then this was kind of a funny situation, because in fact, power plant technology, you know, after the advent of binary, it became very mature. But the exploration risk and the drilling risk and the, you know, the ability to find those very permeable hot zones without the benefit of say 3D seismic like oil and gas has, and it doesn't really work that well in the traditional geothermal domain anyway. But this is something that's being worked on, by the way. It was, you know, how do I say, it's good to know that eventually something would come forward that would support renewables in a bigger way, beyond PURPA, which was a big legislation that required investor-owned utilities to buy independent power from people, including geothermal, and offered a very nice 10-year contract with a capacity bonus to incentivize people to take the risk. So, but what does the Inflation Reduction Act have to do with geothermal? A lot, and other renewables too, and carbon capture and storage too. Basically, it's a tax credit scheme. Either you can take the investment tax credit, meaning subsidizing the cost of your infrastructure, drilling, etc., or you can take a production tax credit, which seems to be the favored route for most geothermal operators, which gives you a bonus payment. Effectively, it increases what you're being paid for that electricity. And we're seeing, just to give you a perspective, you know, geothermal projects had been, you know, selling power to, or sorry, put it the other way, the utilities who bought the power from geothermal operators have been paying about 6 cents per kilowatt hour, $60 per megawatt hour. That was a typical price. Well, the price is ratcheting up now to about 10 cents, I mean, $100 per megawatt hour. And that's a good thing. But if you want to get into, in the United States at least, what will be either the second or third tier of resources, the big obvious ones are, you know, already tapped. A second round was done, and now we're sort of in a third wave, let's call it. This tax credit scheme incentivizes people to take the risk of finding these resources and developing them. So what the tax credits do is basically allow you to increase the revenue for the production tax credit. Basically, it increases the revenue from your production. And they've really done a good job on these this time, giving a long window for geothermal development, because they take time to develop, typically 4 or 5 years before you really get going in a geothermal project. And of course, you've spent a lot of money all that time without any revenue. So this is an important incentive. And they actually, the energy secretary and her team have made it such that union labor and communities that have been disadvantaged, for example, where there's pollution, I mean, think of Baytown, Texas, where there's refineries and pollution. You know, if we could do geothermal there, that would be one of these communities that would give you another lift in the amount of tax credits you get. The other thing about the tax credits is that they are, in many cases, they can be sold to another entity. Let's say you're an operator who doesn't really have a big tax burden. You know, you're in new startup mode and you're spending rather than earning, and therefore you don't have much tax. You can sell them to others. And that was the case in the past too. And there was a very actually vibrant market in trading of production tax credits between entities that did and did not have a a big tax burden. So and then union labor is incentivized. You get a little bump up in the tax credits for that, and also for the use of materials that are sourced in the United States. So
Right.
it is a U.S. centric policy. I mean, it's a U.S.
It's
policy,
the
but it's
onshoring or whatever the terminology. Yeah.
but there's a lot of bits and pieces to it that speak to what's happened in the center of our country, what's referred to poorly, I think, as the Rust Belt, but where people have not prospered as much as, say, on the edges on the coast, and how we can get these communities lifted up through the use of geothermal energy. And of course, the district heating play in certain parts of the country is particularly important. For example, there's a lot going on in North Dakota where it's damn cold in the winter, to do geothermal heating in a district way, more Flores's bailiwick, but it's all geothermal. But I think these tax credits are really important, and I think they're the single biggest boost to geothermal energy that we've seen in the United States, probably since those cost shared drilling days, which were, in the late 70s, early 80s. So there's a lot there.
We like to use this terminology of game changer, right? But perhaps what you've helped fill in the gaps around, just because the complexity and the layers of this bill and other bills, it could be
hard to read.
It could be a game or it could be part of a game change, let's say. But let's go back to this question, because I think you talked a little bit, both of you, around this. Let me go first. We'll go both of you, but Flores, you go first, because this question around workforce development. The specific question from the audience is about increasing the pool of qualified drillers. So speak to that. You've got the rig in your background there, so we'll go to you. But I think there's a broader question there, not just the pool of drillers, but overall workforce development, right? So take both parts of that, please.
Yeah, definitely. There's a big challenge in the market with a lot of those baby boomers who are about to retire with all the knowledge in their heads and leaving the industry. So that's definitely a big challenge for the industry. I think there are two ways of looking at it. It is nice to bring young, enthusiastic people into the market and develop them. That's what I've been doing over the last 10 years, and it worked out quite well. They found their way, but there's also another way, and that's getting those oil and gas minded people into the geothermal arena, and that is also working. I'm seeing more and more people making that step in Europe, and that's more on the management, reservoir engineering, production engineering, drilling engineering side. And then you have that big layer of people in the service companies who can actually really serve both markets. And the framework is already in place. There are development programs for those people. And if you currently look at some of the areas we're involved, then some of those oil and gas drilling engineers are already working for geothermal like 30% of their time. If you look at European onshore drilling activities, geothermal is already playing a big role there. Offshore, of course not. Offshore, it's still a 100% oil and gas market. CCS is coming in, but we're all using the same service companies, service providers, etc. So I think there's already a good development there, and I think there's already a lot of cross learning from both industries. And yes, there's always a shortage when you plan to drill 10 times as many wells as 10 years before. So we have to deal with it, and we have to be cautious about it. You cannot do something which is impossible. When you do have the wrong crew on your rig and the wrong engineers on top of them, you will go into big dramas. So I think for new developers, which are not coming from the oil and gas industries, they have to be very cautious there, and really they really have to understand that they should pay a little bit more to get quality in place, because it will earn out in your development, which is multi-million investment. So I think that's something which is very important to mention here. On the other hand, there is also the oil and gas companies which are entering the market, which have the data, which have the knowledge, and they are engaged to participate in this new industry. So whether they are investor or really executor and operator, at least it's important that in that management, highest level of the organizations, they emphasize the need to have classified and highly skilled people. It will pay out in the end, and I think the people are there. And I also think that with the developments of oil and gas, you can make very smart connections. So if there is a rig somewhere in a basin drilling 10 wells, why not 2 more and make that a good deal? You have to think about small deals which make the bigger picture efficient.
Right, save the mobilization fees for a 2-well geothermal program. I mean, that would be a huge savings for a project.
I would be terrified if the oil and gas onshore industry disappears completely, because you will simply not have enough service companies which can maintain their quality, their teams, etc. So there is a big win-win to have them working beside each other. Sorry.
No, but Anne, go please. And
Yeah,
you believe
I
we're
was-
flying
I
through, and I
was-
want to get to the poll, but let's wrap up this point, and then we can move to the
Okay,
scalability.
I'll try to be quick. I think you're absolutely right, you know, Floris, about there's an age gap in the industry, and we're at Geothermax, you know, we're a consultancy. We're always looking for people. We're filling that with folks who are coming out of university now, typically master's students, you know, finishing up their degrees, and we're hunting for them early because there's competition for people, even new people. But you know, when I think of our group in Geothermax, we have quite a good age range, and so there's at least an ability for succession. But you know, in oil and gas, I would say there's a huge interest in doing geothermal. I mean, if I just look inside our own company, SLB, I get emails every day. Hey, do you have a position for me? You know, could I switch? Of course, getting their managers to release them is another matter, but there's a lot of interest. I'll just say that. And, you know, when I go to things like OTC, I'm always on the hunt for somebody who just has a hankering for geothermal. You know, they really want to change. So I think especially younger people, you know, I think it's tough for younger people to be hired in oil and gas right now, because people don't necessarily want to be in that business. They want to be in a clean energy business. So we've got kind of a pool of people already who are sort of thinking about geothermal and thinking, well, this could be a better technology, whether they're experienced people or just coming out of university. You know, they're there and they're keen. But I think that, you know, something you said about the drilling engineers really resonated with me, Floris, because we don't do drilling, but we manage drilling. And so we hire company men and other drilling people, you know, to support these projects. And the age of these people is high. I'm not going to give a number, but they're really experienced and they know their stuff. So that part, I think, you know, for drilling engineers and drilling supervisors who, you know, really run the show day to day, more experienced geothermal people like that are really lacking. So it's an issue. And I think, you know, we have to do our best to fill it so that we can, you know, have everybody sort of transitioning in that direction. But it's really a theme in SLB, I can tell you.
And Chris, if you don't mind, I'd like to pull you into this, because I mentioned earlier in my opening about, you know, your background and the oil and gas business and change, and obviously, you know, sort of the pivot that you made in the last couple of years. You want to jump in at all on this workforce development, upskilling, reskilling, all of these different ways to look at it?
Well, let me quickly say, Jeremy, I left the oil and gas sector about 4 years ago and transitioned into geothermal. And within the Geothermal Energy Advancement Association, we start to find thousands of people interested to transition into geothermal. And through the association, we've built a group of people who are truly committed to it. If you think back 2 years ago, before GEA was established, there was no IRA deal.
Yeah.
There was no Green New Deal in Europe. And those are now exist. And we saw just yesterday a fund of, I think it was $165 million
Right.
established, which will be dispersed by Geothermal Rising and a consortium.
The GEO project, yeah.
Yes, and this fund, large parts of it will go to the education sector and transitioning skills. Thanks, Jeremy.
No, and I really appreciate that comment and question, because it's probably its own topic we could spend a long time on. In fact, the Institute did a large energy transition workforce readiness assessment of countries in Latin America. Chris, you were part of that last year. And I'll save everyone from reading a 80-page document with the summary. Most countries are not prepared, and it comes back to how have they established national policies, number one, and number two, how do those national policies and regulations translate into things as simple as community colleges, technical vocational schools that don't even remotely have the kinds of curriculums that speak to energy transition, or at least as our assessment of a couple of years ago, they weren't there. Wow, we're flying through. I want to do the poll. Let's move to the question, our wrap up here. And there's a question from the audience, which we can use as a yes or no. I really want to wrap up the panel with this question of where are we going to be? Where's geothermal going to be in 2050? And so the question is, will geothermal successfully scale up by 2050? And it's a yes or no question for Floris and Anne, but we'll give them a yes comma or a no comma, and so we'll allow them to make some final comments. But because I said there was another yes or no, we'll first do this yes or no question. And do you think closed loop geothermal installations will play a significant role compared with conventional geothermal and EGS in the coming decades? Yes or no?
I am doubtful. So
I like it. Okay.
I'll put that as a kind of no. And I'll give you the reason. First of all, well, it depends on what you're talking about. I mean, heat pumps are closed loop systems, and I think those are great. But I think you're talking about deep radiator and reverse kind of closed loop systems. Is that correct? Like Ever is doing. For example.
Yeah, I'm reading the question specifically. Yeah. So
okay.
Yes,
right,
that's right.
So,
yeah, absolutely. That's what they say.
So let's say it's that. Heat conduction is slow, and so the question, and it's proportional to the temperature difference between the rock and what's flowing in the pipes in the radiator. I have some doubts, and there's a big sort of argument raging about this topic, but I think physically it can probably work, but it might be a little bit expensive. Convective heat transfer is just much more efficient than conductive. You can really get the heat going. And I will admit to a bias, because my space has always been the conventional geothermal space. So I think it's going to be tough to build, not impossible, we can build it, but it'll be costly to build. And then you're thinking, everybody wants that triple dilemma, or I don't call it trilemma, of keeping costs for energy down. So will that closed loop solution do that? It's not clear to me. And if it can only be used for heat, it seems a very expensive heating system. So that's my very cagey and not direct answer.
All right. I always love yes or no questions. You said doubtful, and then no, perfect. Floris, same to you, and then we'll come back, and we had the poll pop up. Hopefully folks saw that and are voting, and we'll come back to that.
Yeah.
Floris, any thoughts on this specific question?
Yeah, many thoughts. But your question is it a major change up to 2050? I agree with Anne that will not be the case for the reasons she mentioned. It will, however, be quite an interesting fallback scenario for a lot of exploration wells. So if an exploration well does not find an open reservoir, or if it's not easy to create an EGS system in certain places, it will create value at that particular place to create energy, power, or heat. and therefore I think it will be developed over the next decades. Whether it can really play that change for geothermal, I'm doubtful about because of the production restrictions. So yes, there will be some, but it will not be the main driver as far as I can understand physics related to this system.
So then I'm going to make you, unfortunately, we're not allowed to vote as panelists. So I'll ask you for your vote on this specific, because then the question had, where do you envision? And there's 4 potential answers. I don't know if you can see that on the screen, Flores. So beyond your cautioning just exactly where we'll be with geothermal 2050, which of these would you choose if you had to?
For me, it's clear it's the last one, my favorite renewable energy. I do think it is a key source of heating in many areas around the world, and a good source of power in some places in the world.
Okay.
I'm
right,
totally in agreement. I think the heating opportunity is amazing, and decarbonizing heating is not insignificant. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is really important. A principal source of power, no, but a much larger source of power than we see today. So I'm going for 5% of electricity in 2050.
And you said we're at around 1%, right?
Less.
So that's a huge step. I mean, that's,
It is, and it means drilling a lot of wells. So we'll keep the drilling industry.
Well, we're back to the
very
drilling engineers.
Right.
The drillers. We're back to the drillers. Chris, hey, has got to get to work, man.
Well, it's about 5%, well, about 4.5% of electricity in the state of California. Now, California is blessed with these resources,
Right.
but all deep basins could be developed for geothermal, and to varying degrees, and not just to green up your oil field, to sell to the grid. So right. I'm bullish on geothermal, as you know. I think it takes many forms that will allow it to become a more significant part of the power mix.
And I think that's been the best part of this entire series. And thank you both. And thank you, Chris. I think I had the power blinders. I had the geothermal energy blinders. And I don't think I really appreciate how much this has helped me better understand that heat and there's alternative or other uses, let's say. So I'm going for key source of heating just because of everything I've learned through these webinars. All right, Chris, you have to answer as well, please.
Yes, my answer was absolutely a key source of heat because it's available everywhere. And the world wants energy security. So the challenges of getting geothermal for power and very high temperatures is very difficult in many countries, but as a source of heat, yes. And if I can take the opportunity, let me answer the closed loop question as well. There are some very interesting tests of technology at the moment. We're well aware of EVO's efforts, and I note that Serafi also announced a test of a closed loop system in an unused oil and gas well. And I think that's going to give key results this year.
And speaking of results, man, I love these segues. Speaking of results, they've popped up. I hope you all can see them. Wow. The audience, overwhelming agreement, I think I would call this consensus, that we really are looking towards 2050 with geothermal as a key source of heating, 71%. We did lose a few people. They've dropped off as we head to the top of the hour. But of those who voted, we're talking 3/4 here almost. So I think the answer is in, and I think we all agree with some parentheses. It's 8:59 in California, and I want to say thank you to Francesca. That's not actually Francesca's picture. That's Diana Rodriguez, who's on a holiday in Colombia. Maybe we'll have more on geothermal in Colombia when she comes back. But thank you, Francesca, for stepping in and pitch hitting, as we say. Appreciate all you've done to make this. And thank you to Anne, thank you to Flores, and thank you to Chris. Round of virtual applause. Fantastic session. It's 9 o'clock on the dot, and this has been a wonderful 1 hour session. We will get this recording together next week and share it with everyone. And our 3-part series is now officially over. I'm a bit sad to say, but it has been extremely informative. Thank you all so much. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everybody. Take care and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.